Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Film Studies online discussion. We will be talking about the Wes Anderson film, The Darjeeling Limited, which was recommended to us by our resident Wes Anderson scholar, Lisa DeKnight, who joins us. Good evening, Lisa.
Hello, Andrew. How are you?
I'm fine. Yourself?
Doing great, thank you.
As I was saying to you a few moments ago before we sort of went live, I hadn't seen this movie until recently since 2007 when it came out. And I had a significantly different and better appreciation for it. I think primarily because of changes to me, which is one of the things I love about these discussions. And I think a lot of the people who join us do as well, because they either see a movie for the first time and can imagine having a different reaction to it, or they revisit something. And we look forward to hearing those thoughts and reactions, whether they're to the first viewing or subsequent ones. The way to let us know if you have a question or comment is to please raise your hand using the raise hand function within Zoom. I will call on you at that point. I'll call on folks in the order their hands appear to me, and I will usually can get to everybody once and maybe a second time, depends on how many folks are participating. But until I call on you to ask your question or make your comment, please keep your audio on mute. That way, everyone will be able to hear everyone and there won't be any feedback or anything like that. And then once you ask your question or comment after I call on you, please put yourself back on mute. In addition, the chat function will be running tonight, and we would love for you to jump in there, say hi, especially if you're from outside the greater Philadelphia area. And if you're from really far outside the greater Philadelphia area, please visit the Where in the World section within Film Studies Online at our website, brynmarfilm.org. We've had folks join us from all over the country and all over the world, and especially a very active contingent from Texas. So we would love to hear more from folks from all sorts of places. Let us know how you heard about us and how things are going in your film viewing and discussion world. And I believe with that, we are ready to get started. And oh my goodness, somebody beat the Glussmans to the punch. Mark it down. Our first person tonight is Gene. Gene, how are you?
Woohoo! Reigning champion. Hi. Well, thank you so much for recommending this, Lisa. It's only one of two Anderson films I hadn't seen, and I really enjoyed it. The other, still haven't seen Life Aquatic, but I'm planning to get to it. But two quick things. I want to tell you what I took from the final shot of the film. It's the one running under the credits. It's just the train running along the track. And I think it was perfect because it sums up everything for me. First, it represents a journey, like the one the characters are going through. And it's not a speeding train. It's a relaxed train with kind of a hypnotic sound of the train, clicking along the tracks under the music. And I think it suggests like a harmony and a peace that the brothers are searching for and may find in the end. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. But I also found that the film isn't as strictly symmetrical in its composition as some of the others, and wondering if that's really because Anderson had less control of his compositions because they were shooting on a real train instead of something he had constructed for the film.
Well, thanks for those, Gene. Those are a couple of really interesting points. I will just start off by saying when I was in college and graduate school, I don't remember who told me, but I think it was the screenwriting instructor said that the first 10 pages of a screenplay are the most important part of the screenplay, and the last 10 minutes of a movie are the most important part of the movie. And I don't know if that credit sequence at the end goes a full 10 minutes, but it's a big chunk of the end of the movie. And I think, you make a really good point. I think that any filmmaker, particularly one as focused on minutia and with as great an attention to detail as Wes Anderson seems to have over the course of his career, we should think about why we are left to look at that. and what that composition and that movement and that pace and all of those things means. And I think you had some good thoughts on that. Lisa, what were your thoughts on that ending?
Gina, I loved your comments, and I'm so glad that you got to experience Darjeeling Limited for the first time. You'll have to catch The Life Aquatic too. I will be curious down the road to hear your thoughts on that. I really think that you are setting a good tone for the usage of symbolism in this conversation, because someone could easily say, Anderson's symbols are too obvious, too simple. A train, a journey through life, or throwing the baggage, letting the father's baggage behind, physical and metaphorical. I love the kind of emphatic effect of these relatively simple symbols. It makes it so clear and elegant, and you expressed very well what I love so much about that ending too. It is about a journey. It's not about an epiphany. It's about a series of small steps towards bettering, which is the journey through life, ideally. And so that ending to me is brilliant, and I really co-sign everything you said about it. And as for the symmetrical shots, that's an interesting comment. On the train, Anderson had absolute control over everything. He retrofitted it to his exact specifications. Everything was just as he wanted it, but outside the train is where kind of butted up against the real world and its chaos and messiness. But I do think that in the train also there's kind of a lack of this crystal clear symmetry that you see in something like the Grand Budapest Hotel, and that's because these three brothers are so divided, and so they're parceled off in interesting ways, kind of visually and kind of cinematographically, even in the train where Anderson had full control. So interesting comments. Thanks for making them.
Yeah, I think that we saw shots of the exterior or from the exterior of the train earlier in the film that seemed a bit more aggressive, a bit more perilous, a bit less stable. I'm thinking of when Jason Schwartzman sees Rita when they're having their cigarettes at a distance and things like that. And I think this shot of the train, by contrast, is relatively smooth and stable and moving forward. And that's a reflection, I think, as Lisa was saying, and I think Jean suggested, of the change in the relationship, the status of the relationship, or the feelings between the brothers, which is a wonderful way to try to convey that visually. The other thing I would add regarding the compositions is I obviously had total control on the train. I think that while obviously there were many things about that train that couldn't have existed for real, Anderson did seem committed to and interested in maintaining the sense of space by making the rooms seem smaller and having the sorts of things that would be necessary to have within passenger train cars. And I think that might have also limited the symmetry a bit. But yeah, being out in the world, certainly more so than in many of his other films, certainly had an impact on that as well. Okay, I just want to say before we get to the next folks that there are only 2 hands raised right now, and that doesn't really seem right. So I hope folks aren't being shy, and look forward to seeing some more hands as we proceed. But for now, I'm sorry to have to give the silver medal to the Glussmans, at least this one time.
Well, and any medal from you, I would relish. Lisa, one of the things that was interesting, and Janice and I saw this when it first came out, and we both recall not really appreciating. I don't want to say we didn't enjoy it, but we didn't fully appreciate it, and I don't think we fully got it. I'm not sure we fully got it this time either, but we got closer. And the music and his use of the native Indian music, along with the outside shots that were all on site, just really brought you almost. I almost could smell the Indian spices. Is sort of a way I might describe it. I think the music adds more to that than you first realize. You're looking at things, but the music is there regularly. And I thought you might want to comment on that. And the Whitman boys start out at some level, like many normal families that have experienced the death, and they sort of go back and forth as to whether or not they're normal. And I think at one point they even say, can we be the brothers that we were? And I guess one of the questions is, were they ever those brothers? And what is Wes telling us about the range of families and how they react to these things? I thought that in some level that the complexity of the characters was well developed, and every once in a while something would seem to be a little more cursory, focusing on some of the things like the razor and the glasses. They almost were so focused that they were comedic, and yet he was really trying, I think, to be serious about explaining the relationship. And maybe you would mention about that. But at the end, it was a vacation trip of sorts with a largely dysfunctional family, emotional interaction, buried, awkward, and yet at some level, I guess many of us could understand it, even if not from our own families. So thank you for picking it. Thanks for letting us and helping us see it again, and see what your thoughts are.
Well, thank you for that, David. There were a lot of things that we could pick up on there, and I think I'll give Lisa first crack.
Okay. David, I'm so glad that you enjoyed it more this time. Andrew and I were talking before this chat started, and I think Andrew said at the top, I've had such an evolution with this movie. I saw it back in 2007 and didn't really think much of it at all. And it's evolved into one of my favorite Anderson movies. I can almost credit my husband for making me watch it a couple more times to really get it under my skin. He saw it from the beginning. He saw its greatness. But it really does speak to family dynamics, even if I haven't experienced them myself. I understand what it must be like to be in that sort of sibling relationship. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The music issue you brought up first is great. I'm so glad you brought up the music, because it's really Wes Anderson had never been to India before he directed this film. He fell in love with India through film, and used kind of highlighted how he was first drawn to India by the usage of the music in this film, which is all taken from, well, I mean, there are some classical compositions and great Kinks songs, but in terms of the Indian music, it's taken from films by Satyajit Ray or Merchant Ivory Productions. So it's really him highlighting how he fell in love with India and sharing that with us, that kind of real evocation of what drew him in is the same that's drawing us in, and the music is exceptional. I agree. It really brings you into this both reality and complete dreamlike version of India. It's both incredibly real because he's shooting in the streets, but it's also a cinematic version of India, and I think that tension is really interesting. And you spoke eloquently about the range of family dynamics in this film, and I'll just say I really appreciated your comments on some the absurdity of some of the traits that they exhibited, and I love how in this film you can kind of sum up each one of the brothers with a particular kind of absurd trait at the very beginning, but then as the film goes along, more and more of their personalities or their personal drivers come into the fold. Each one kind of has their own way of processing trauma and grief, or not processing it, that we're introduced to at the beginning. Francis is ordering everyone their dinner, controlling everything with his laminated itineraries, and Peter is hoarding his dad's things, and then Jack can only think in short stories, trying to fictionalize his lived experience. And yet those which could just be rolled up as an absurd trait to label each one as kind of archetype, you learn so much more about the brothers through their interactions with each other, and then through the interactions with the exterior world. So it's just an interesting dynamic for siblings, but also to just watch how people interact with the larger environment.
I'm really glad you mentioned the music being borrowed from and inspired by films by filmmakers like Satyajit Ray, and it's a good reminder that and I'll certainly admit to this, that I focus so much on Anderson as a stylist, as an aesthetic auteur, that I sometimes miss the historical sources and his awareness and appreciation and real sort of respect for past eras that allow him to create the Grand Budapest Hotel, or, as we're going to hopefully see later this year, the French Dispatch, or even to an extent something like Rushmore. And I think that, the fact that he was introduced to India through its movies is not just appropriate given, the fact that he's a filmmaker, but it's how so many Americans were introduced to India when the Ray films first came over here in the 50s. We forget that sometimes in this world where we have the internet and we have cable television and people travel far more widely than they ever did before, that for most Americans, their first, visual and sort of cultural exposure to Japan would have been Akira Kurosawa movies coming here in the 1950s. And for India, it would have been Ray movies coming here in the 1950s as well. And it's a good sort of reminder of film history too. I also think that something that David talked about, the Francis's interest in the brothers getting back to being the way they were. And we get a glimpse of how they were, at least, it's in the crucible of their father's, imminent funeral, but we get a sense of how they'd been at least the year before. And, it doesn't seem, to me, it doesn't seem all that different from how they are then, or in the quote unquote present. And that tells us something about nostalgia. And that tells us something about how families, people idealize all sorts of things. We idealize all sorts of things in our lives. And oftentimes those idealized versions come from media. And, Francis wasn't really interested, I don't think, in them being how they used to be. He was interested in them being how they never were, but how brothers are supposed to be in his mind. And I like that the movie doesn't have to sort of announce that to us. It shows it to us. It demonstrates it in their interactions. And that's what, that's one of the hallmarks of good filmmaking. Joss, you have a question or comment?
Yes. I thought this film was just delightful. I had not seen it before. I had seen The Royal Tenenbaums when it first came out and was totally puzzled by it. And The Life Aquatic, I had a very similar response. And I feel like I have to go back and see them now with some greater perspective. I've seen some of a couple of Anderson's later films, the more popular ones, and by then were more accessible. So I will have to go back and see those others and see how they play. There was so many details, which is typical of Anderson. Just the appearance of one of his stock players, Bill Murray, in a role with no dialogue. He was credited at the end as the businessman, not as their father. And I was wondering about that, if anybody had any thoughts about that. A couple of other things. In terms of the music, the Indian, wonderful local Indian music aside, a couple of songs that really stood out in my mind. One that had appeared in Hotel Chevalier. Thank you, Lisa, for that tip. Where Do You Go To, My Lovely, which just always has struck me as this angry guy pissed off at his girlfriend. And I never really liked the song because of that's what it seemed to be to me. And also the Rolling Stones' Play with Fire, which was a very similarly themed song, although I liked it much better. I think those certainly illuminated Jack's character. Couple of other little things, the Indian performers. Some wonderful little performances by Indian actors. I would cite in particular Irfan Khan as the father of the young boy who was killed, who was a very well-known actor, even in America, and I think probably after that. And it was just wonderful to see him in this role. And then the guy who was sitting there with them at dinner, totally silent, totally oblivious to what they were up to. And he was just there. And I thought that was wonderful. And then finally, part of what I liked about this film was how, and this relates back to the train at the end, the sense of hope for these guys. That, they were not entirely lost in their family dynamics, and that there was hope that they could have meaningful lives going forward. Okay, that was a lot of stuff to pick and choose. And thank you again for this wonderful recommendation.
Andrew, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. That's what I get for trying to not let people hear me drink. Thank you, Joss, for all of those wonderful points. I think there was a lot there. The one that I'm struck by, and I really have to hear what Lisa has to say about this, and I'm embarrassed to say it hadn't occurred to me, was the notion of Bill Murray possibly his character possibly representing their father in some way. It just hadn't occurred to me, but it's a brilliant insight. And I'm wondering, Lisa, what you think of that.
Thank you so much for all of those amazing comments. I can't wait to respond to all of them between me and Andrew. But yeah, specifically on that is a great insight. I see so many different potentials for that wonderful Bill Murray cameo in the beginning. And it's really interesting to think about how this film came after The Life Aquatic, which was, of course, Bill Murray's biggest role in Anderson's work at that point, and Anderson's biggest commercial and critical failure. Well, really his only commercial and critical failure at that point. And so I personally kind of read a lot into, Bill Murray kind of running and missing the train is just kind of like this, eulogy for The Life Aquatic. And that's me reading way too much into it. But I love the other alternate of seeing this father figure. And Adrian Brody is hoarding his dad's, or sorry, Peter is hoarding his dad's glasses that have his very heavy prescriptions still in it. And so that slow-mo where you're watching Peter lifting up the glasses to kind of look at who he just ran by, that always kind of pierces me a little bit too, as this is an older man who is running at top speed and he's going to miss the train. So it's I don't know if I would say it's directly corresponding to his deceased father, but I absolutely think you can read that into it. I think it's a really elegant melange of different things.
I think the fact that we see him again at the end, that he's in one of those tiny sort of vignette train of that, in that sort of train of relationships where we see Natalie Portman and we see Peter's wife. I think the fact that we see him again suggests that he has some larger importance than just being a guy who was also trying to make the train. And it hadn't occurred to me before Josh suggested it. And I agree. It's not, it's left vague on purpose because it doesn't work if it's too sort of on the nose, but I think it's at least meant to make us think about that, to suggest it. Was there anything else you wanted to say? I don't know if you took notes on everything Josh said.
I jotted down Bill Murray, Kumar. So yes, I did jot down a couple of things because it just gave us so much good stuff to work with. The performances by the Indian actors, I'm so glad you mentioned that, and specifically the ones that you call it out, because I'm really going to hate myself because I can't remember the actor's last name. Kumar Palana, I believe it's something like that. But the Indian man who was sitting in the dining cart at the end of the table reading the newspaper while they were the brothers were having some horrible conversation amongst themselves. I love that scene too, because clearly this is a first class train compartment. This man, he speaks English, but they're just totally ignoring his existence. But he is just so curious in this kind of passive way about these strange men at his table. It's so funny. And that actor was in all of Wes Anderson's films until he passed, I believe, in 2013 or 2014. Excellent actor. He played Mr. Little Jeans, Pagoda in The Royal Tenenbaums, and just such a great presence. I love seeing him pop up in his films. And Irfan Khan, thank you for mentioning him too, because his performance is basically wordless in the funeral sequence, and yet his emotional heft just punches you. It's a tremendous performance that does so much with his physicality. Great actor. And I mean, there are many other great Indian performances or performances by Indian actors that we could mention, but thank you for kind of calling those out. And I'll also note, before I kind of toss it back to Andrew, I too see hope for the brothers at the end. A lot of Anderson's films up to that point were, they all kind of ended on a quite optimistic note. I mean, tinged with grief and anger and sadness in many ways, but they were so frequently optimistic. And I think there is hope for the brothers, but it's much more, it's couched more in that they have a long journey ahead, which I think, again, as was discussed earlier, I think that the train symbolizes so beautifully. But you hear them say, okay, well, let's go grab a drink and a smoke, which is exactly how they started this whole journey. So they they didn't get some neat epiphany. They didn't get some, catharsis, some beautiful catharsis out of their trip to India. They got another step down the road to betterment. And I think that is hope and optimism enough, and very honest hope and optimism about how people actually grow in the world.
Well said. Jessica, you have a question or comment? Nope. Oh,
There were just
there
a
you
couple. Yeah, there
Go
was
ahead.
just a couple of comments to things people had mentioned before. So about the glasses, I do think some of the symbolism is on the nose, but I think that's okay. I think it's very clear what he's trying to communicate, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's kind of giving you that there. So obviously the glasses are a memento from his father, but it also seems to be something that's literally making it so he can't see the world around him, which I really feel has an interesting symbology to it. That was my interpretation anyways with the glasses. And about the ending and it being cautiously optimistic, there was a scene too with Francis when he's looking at his bandages and they comment on how he still has a lot more healing to do. So I feel like there's that symbolism too of the progress, but it's just one step in that direction. There's still a lot to go for to keep going in that direction. And then I also wanted to say, I love a road movie without a road. So I always appreciate that. And I think there was one or two more things, but I'm drawing a blank. So I'm going to be quiet for a little bit and see what everyone else thinks.
Well, thanks for those comments, Jessica. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the glasses because I think that's there's a long history in American movies of characters who have a flawed view of the world, wearing glasses, and that being a key element. The one that stands out most to me is you'd see this a lot in the melodramas, Hollywood melodramas of the 40s and 50s, where the female protagonist who wanted to have or be or do something that women weren't supposed to do back then had glasses because she was seeing the world in a warped way. Humoresque is a favorite film of mine, and one where she had, Joan Crawford has the nerve to have the hots for John Garfield, and her thick prescription keeps reminding us that she's not supposed to lust after a man in the view of the time. And here I think that it operates in a not entirely similar but not entirely dissimilar way, that Adrien Brody is so reluctant to sort of give up the past or let go of the father. And we saw that when he's determined to get the car started in the flashback, and we see it that he has all those objects that he he's have his father's glasses frame. He kept the lenses in, he kept the prescription in because he wouldn't even let go of that, and that's how it's obviously giving him the headaches, right? And it's because he keeps trying to see the world through his father's eyes, to go through the world as if his father hasn't left. And I noticed that at the end of the film, for whatever reason, he doesn't seem to have those headaches anymore. Is it because he's learned to rely on the glasses less? Is it because he's changed his vision to see things differently based on their experiences? I'm not sure, but what is clear is that there's been some movement there, some transformation there, and at least his reaction, his harsh negative reaction, or this, I should say, a side effect to wearing the glasses has gone away. And I think it's a wonderful use of a symbol that occurs a lot throughout Hollywood. I think this was a pretty, as you say, on the nose, but not in a didactic way, use of it. Lisa.
I think what makes the on the nose symbolism work for me is that it's in the same film with so many extremely nuanced and subtle aesthetic constructs. Like I kind of love how Anderson says, baggage equals spiritual baggage, but also gives us something as as really quite elegant as this flashback in the funeral sequence that is, you know, framed by a short story. There's this, you know, artistic remove coupled with, you know, layers upon layers of emotion, and how, you know, the traumatic past is melding with the traumatic present through the construct of art. It's so, I mean, you could write a term paper on how elegant something like that is, and how you have to kind of really dig into its intricacies and nuances. And so I feel like he balances his scales pretty well with you know, fun is the wrong word, but with more straightforward symbolism that he's using for kind of this emphatic effect, with these other extremely nuanced aesthetic constructs.
Yeah, that's one of the other things I was going to mention. The other thing I noticed was, so Wes Anderson is kind of renowned for his symmetry, and there's certain characteristics of this film that really have become kind of his signature style. And one of them is the symmetry. And we talked about there's a little bit of an absence or asymmetry introduced. And I really noticed in the film car, or sorry, in the film car, in the train car, and it's really subtle. And I don't know if I caught it the first time, but it looks like there's symmetry in the train car. There's the main entrance, and then there looks to be two windows on each side, but one of them is actually a mirror. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that. So it's almost symmetry, but I feel like there's a lot of hidden meaning between the one window and one being a mirror.
I hadn't picked up on that, but I'm, you know, given how meticulous he tends to be, he and his art director tend to be about the worlds they create. It, you know, it must have been a choice with a reason behind it.
I agree.
Before we get to the next folks with their hands up, I wanted to, there's something that's come up in the chat a couple of times, and folks would like us to talk about the mother. In particular, what seems to be the kind of contrast or contradiction maybe between, you know, what Patricia or Anjelica Huston's character, what she seems to sort of believe as her overall philosophy, what she seems to value in terms of where she's, you know, focused her life and her attention, and how that gels or doesn't, or contradicts or doesn't her relationship with her family. And then the extent to which we see that, we learn in, you know, later in the film, that Francis's tendency to want to order for everyone and do all other things like that comes from her. And yeah, I mean, my sort of view of this is that, you know, this happens in the world a lot, right? This happens a lot. And you may know people like this who, for example, work in a field that requires tremendous patience and compassion, or openness, or what have you. Pick the attribute that isn't always easy to embody. And those people can be quite good at doing that for their job, but then outside of their job, they, even if it's only because, you know, that's what they have to work at, you know, 50, 40, 50, 60 hours a week. They don't want to have to work at it so much outside of their job. You see that. And, you know, Patricia clearly not only has a different view of what traits are important for a person to possess in sort of their work in the public sphere and at home, but she also really seems to have a very different idea, from a very unconventional idea, let's put it that way, of what motherhood is and the obligation a mother has to her children. And I think it's interesting the way the film handles it, because the film could have been a lot nastier about her. The film could have, those boys could have been more vindictive, and the film could have depicted and treated her more harshly than it does. And I think it's a nuanced depiction, and the film sort of has a nuanced reaction to her. Lisa, your thoughts on this topic?
I really co-sign a lot of what you just said. I think that the film is kind of leading us to believe that her devotion to other people, or to these this orphanage, this convent, is kind of another form of hiding from her her sons, her obligations, if you will, as a mother. The thing that always, and I agree with Andrew entirely, that it's a very nuanced portrayal of this particular person who happens to be a mother. The line that all, or the exchange that always jumps out at me, is when she says, "Oh, what's that hideous flower pot that's burning?" And then immediately, when she realizes that this is Alice's flower pot, she just, in the same honeyed voice, "Oh, I would love a flower pot, please." And that slipperiness, it sticks with me so much. So she is both extremely honest with herself, but also extremely dishonest with the people in her life. And I think that's a very brave and interesting portrayal of a person, of a mother. I think it's a fascinating portrayal, and I get so much out of the portrayal. But I do fundamentally agree that the film is not vilifying her, just like it's not vilifying the three sons. It's just a very interesting portrayal of someone that doesn't really want to be a mother. And I also want to kind of put into the conversation that I think Wes Anderson films kind of benefit from playing off each other. I also see a lot of Royal Tenenbaum, Gene Hackman's character, kind of wrapped into an understanding of Angelica Houston's character in this film. And I think there's possibility that 10, 15 years down the line, maybe she has a change of heart and wants to come back into their lives, but very equally possibly she doesn't. But I think that Wes Anderson films kind of play off each other, the characters, because they're recurring actors. And so many of them, I think there's this play off of what has come before as well. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't go so far as to sort of try to give us the sense really that there's some sort of extended universe, or that, like in Quentin Tarantino, you see the brands shared across movies or things like that. But yes, I mean, he, it's like, it's almost like there's an auteur star text that you sort of, I know that you've seen my other movies, at least a lot of you have. And I know that there are going to be elements that are going to remind you. And I think there's nothing wrong. I mean, authors do that, in literature all the time. They don't make direct callbacks to, but, they expect that at least some of the people will get a bit more of the nuance because they've sort of been down the road with them before, even if it was a different road. I thought Linda in the chat said, that the mother was another sort of piece of baggage, and they discard it. And I think that's true. I think that, I think the mother is unapologetically selfish. And that, I mean, one of the boys asks her, her sons asked her why she didn't go to their father's funeral. She says, "Because I didn't want to." I mean, think about, and not even saying it with any hostility or aggression, just that was, I couldn't, that she said it with the same tone as I couldn't get a flight or I was sick or what have you, except it was her choice. She doesn't say something about her relationship with their father. She doesn't say something about how remote where she is, et cetera, et cetera. That's just it. And, the talk about, the comment about how Frances has taken on her sort of trait of ordering for everybody, that's a way to be selfish and controlling while trying to appear not to. right? How can someone say that I'm being selfish? I'm giving things to people. I'm giving him cookies. I'm giving him scrambled eggs. But of course, you're dictating and you're deciding what everyone is going to have and how things are going to be. And that's a form of selfishness, right? It's extending your control, your sphere of influence at, beyond where a lot of people would say it should be. And that's something you see. The boys all have their own type of selfishness, right? And so I think that that's where they reject, because they have to reject they can't all be carbon copies of their mother, because one, that's not really credible, and two, Francis started doing that and they wouldn't want to be like their older brother. But we see Adrian Brody's selfishness in his sort of hoarding of their father's belongings, and not thinking that, gee, maybe I should discuss this before I lay claim to it. And we see Jason Schwartzman's selfishness in his, particularly if you see Hotel Chevalier, again, he, it's an interesting kind of selfishness, and we see it we see it in Darjeeling too, where there's some giving to it, but it's about giving in order to very immediately and quickly get what he wants. Or to set the stage so there are favorable turn of events for him. So, you see how that selfishness that the mother exhibits quite, freely, how that sort of filtered down into her sons. Lillian, you had a question or comment.
I was going to talk about the mother, but you've covered that pretty much. She was a pretty selfish lady. I got the impression maybe they didn't even know where she was until Owen Wilson searched her out, how long she had been gone or anything. You don't really know much about her, except that she's been an absentee. I wanted to talk about the rescue of the children in the river, which I found amazing. There was I guess Francis was the one who said, we got to go in and get those kids, but there was no hesitation. Everybody jumped. Everybody did the best that they could. Adrian Brody, I think, maybe learned a tremendous lesson, because he lost that child and the child was killed. But that was, to me, a very important part of this film.
Yeah, I think it was. And I find it interesting how it's handled, because if someone were, I can imagine if I read this screenplay, perhaps, or if someone was telling me what happens in this movie and they got to that point and said, and then the three brothers see this happening and they jump into action, I would have said, what? That doesn't sound like those guys. That's not who we've been following. But there's something about the way it occurs in the movie and when it occurs in the movie and what those three men need at that moment, sort of personally, that makes it work and made it credible to me. And I agree, as you said, Lillian, surprisingly powerful. Perhaps, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and the fact that, that they're invited to stay for the funeral, and they stay for the funeral. And they are obviously extremely touched by what happened to them, and watching what happened to all those people.
Yeah. And to me, I think it's the first, or certainly the most significant show of emotion that at least we see from the Adrian Brody character. And from the others to a degree as well. I think it's very interesting. Lisa, did you have thoughts on that sequence?
That sequence, well, to kind of take a step back, every time I watch a Wes Anderson film, even if I've seen it 50 times, I am struck anew at just how unpredictable they are narratively. When you think of a Wes Anderson film, you have this, maybe you do or maybe you don't, I have this image of something that's kind of a consistent product. I just, if I'm free associating, I think consistent product, Wes Anderson, but they're really just so unpredictable. Like you really don't know where the narrative is going to go next. And I mean, in Rushmore, I'm always shocked when he's actually expelled from Rushmore. It shocks me. And I really do think, I preface all of that, but to say, I really do think that this film earns that scene. There, and I kind of alluded to this in my intro, back in 2007 and even now, there are definitely some critiques of this film that go kind of along the lines of, well, an Indian boy had to die for 3 wealthy white men to have some sort of life epiphany. And I think that is kind of a deliberate misread of that scene, especially when you consider Adrian. I think Anderson is really playing with something quite dicey and honest and authentic with his choice of words, with Adrian Brody coming out of the river and saying, "I didn't save mine." And it's a line that just, I think about it all the time. Like it kind of haunts me because it's so narcissistic and crass on one hand, overly personalizing this Indian boy as a thing that he his 2 brothers checked the box, but he didn't check the box. But it's Adrian Brody's character not knowing how to process such a terrible and like monumental event that he tried very hard to write. And I wrestle with that line all the time, and I really appreciate Wes Anderson's extreme sensitivity to language in his film in putting that line out there, because it really kind of colors everything that comes after. And that amazing funeral scene where there is this really authentic emotion and grief and sadness for the community, but also a real shame at the sheer difference between the way that this loving community is coming together in grief and the way that he and his brothers came together in their grief. And it's such an elegant scene, and I really do agree with you that it's the pivot on which this film lives and dies, and it's a very important one to everything that came after. But it's not some sort of clean epiphany either, and I think that's what makes it so honest, is because this is a tremendously devastating moment for the father, for the family, for the community, also for the 3 brothers. But that boy's death doesn't give them absolute catharsis and clarity. Like it's really quite real in the way that events occur and our way of processing them and kind of learning from them and moving forward. So I just said a lot, but I love that scene, and I'm so glad that you called it out.
Well, and Catherine in the chat brings up something that I was going to mention, which is that, it's no coincidence that it's Adrian Brody's character who says that, because he's the one who has, his wife is expecting a child, and he's obviously not comfortable with being a father. And we're not, we know it's at least in part because he said he was planning to leave his wife, but one can also imagine that he's completely terrified of what that responsibility is and what, will he be up to it, and all those things. It would appear he would probably say his parents didn't very much seem up to it or didn't do such a great job, so why would he? And so, when he says that mine, I think you're right. I think it has the potential to be so ugly a line, but the combination of the moment in the film and Brody's delivery really, make it more something to think about than to sort of react to. Yeah, I think that's a very moving scene. And someone else in the chat mentioned, that, they jump at that funeral in part because they end up missing their fathers, right? That they haven't mourned together. They tried to jumpstart an old Porsche, but they haven't mourned together. So it's a chance for them to do that. And, to really fulfill part of the mission that, Francis lays out for them, if indirectly and unexpectedly. Ken, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, hi. I wanted to add my thanks to Lisa, to the others who've done it. I guess we should thank Lisa's husband also for pushing her with this. But I had seen this movie some years ago that I remember, and not really thinking too much of it. And I have to admit, watching it this weekend, I don't think there were 10 minutes of it that looked familiar to me. I like this so much better than what I saw last time. So I'm really glad that you recommended it and got us to see it again. And what I liked is it kind of explored all areas. It went from the very serious, the sad part of the young boy dying and drowning, to the funny parts, to the absurd. And there are a couple of parts that made me laugh out loud. The first one that you've mentioned a few times is when they met their mother, and it turned out that's where Francis got his traits from. That it was, his mother was the same way. And I also love the scene at the end with the Rolling Stones music, where they went through each compartment of the train, and then you saw the manager of the train playing with the snake that he said had died. And I guess I should have expected it, but I had a laugh out loud when I saw it. And maybe I missed it somewhere, but Lisa, you talked about a short film that was put together in relation to this.
Yep, Hotel Chevalier. Probably I should have more specifically directed people towards it. It is playing on YouTube if you want to watch it, but I saw some comments in the chat about, why was there a separate short film for this? And just very briefly, Hotel Chevalier stars Jason Schwartzman and his girlfriend, on again, off again girlfriend, played by Natalie Portman. She visits him in a hotel room that he's been holed up in, and it does have a lot of interplay with the feature film.
So that's something we need to find separately.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not on even on Just Watch. It's sort of not commercially available by itself. But as Lisa said, it is on YouTube. You can easily find a free version to see on YouTube.
Well, I noticed him wearing the Hotel Chevalier bathrobe while his brothers were wearing clothes that said Darjeeling Limited. It looks like he still had the bathrobe from the Hotel Chevalier. But as I said, this was, I was not expecting a lot, and I was so pleasantly surprised by how enjoyable this film was. And I don't think I've seen any other Wes Anderson movies, so now I'm going to have to make an effort to see those too.
Well, we're glad you're going to, Ken. Thanks. Lisa would never say this, so I'll just say it to the group, that I'm convinced that at least a good number of the people who have said to us, either in the chat or to me in email or here, that tonight, that they have a greater appreciation for the film than when they saw it, 14 odd years ago. I would have to say that Lisa's introduction at least has a small part in that happening. So that's one of the things that we try to do with these discussions, and I'm glad it worked here. Regarding the question in the chat about why sort of Hotel Chevalier wasn't put at the beginning of the film proper, since it is a prologue, and I have to say I think it's because it provides some interesting and valuable exposition for the Schwartzman character, but at the end of the day, it's a film about the relationship between the brothers, and he has to get to that much more quickly. And if he gives the Schwartz Jack that 15 minutes or 13 minutes of focused exposition and doesn't for the others, it's going to suggest an imbalance of character and story that he doesn't want to suggest. So I think it makes sense. I think it is a valuable companion to the film, but I can certainly, I'm glad he had the discipline to leave it out. Not all filmmakers would have.
I also think that it serves to further, because Jason Schwartzman's character has controlled every last aspect of this hotel room. He is completely set apart. He's walled himself off from the world, and into his perfectly, hermetically sealed escape pod comes chaos in the form of Natalie Portman. So in a way, I think it functions as a nice kind of microcosm of the larger narrative feature, but it also kind of serves to further wall off his psyche and kind of show just how walled off he feels and is from the rest of the world by making it kind of a separate part from the feature film. It's another way I've used the phrase aesthetic construct. It's another of these really thoughtful aesthetic constructs that Anderson is playing with this experience.
And as Catherine pointed out rightly in the chat, it's the Hotel Chevalier is the fodder for that story, that short story that Schwartzman reads to Owen Wilson at the end, toward the end of the movie. So it has an appearance. Mike, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, hi. You might recognize my last name. I'm upstairs and Lisa's downstairs right now. She insisted I do this. I actually was going to speak about the mother, so maybe I still will, even though you've kind of covered a lot of it. The notion of her being selfish or what have you, I mean, I do wonder if she rejected a certain type of life that the boys ultimately reject by the end of the movie, the wealthy, materialistic, kind of disconnected with herself. And these guys are like 40. So there is this element of like, what do you need exactly? Why are you here? I might be your mother, but enough's enough to some degree. And she is helping children as well. I think that might be a deliberate choice to say, there are these children who need her a lot more than her greedy sons do. So she's found an outlet for her maternal instinct that's more valuable to her. And the Murray character at the beginning, whether he's symbolism for the father or not, you see him hanging on really tight to those bags as he's running for the train. And at the end of the film, you see the boys letting them go in order to make it onto the train. And I do think the theme of the movie, one of many, is, as you get older, it becomes more difficult to let those bags go. Like my parents, I'm seeing it. I'm sure many people have seen it throughout their life. You become more set in your flaws unless you start to work on them and get rid of them while you're still flexible, literally and figuratively. And I think that's something that the mother character, especially, we kind of visit with her to see what would happen to Owen Wilson specifically, but all the boys, if they continue down their path. They might snap and just leave their family, or they might they might get in a huge argument before a funeral, which they do. But you see the man who works at the garage seems to be the person in the most grief over the father during that scene. It's not really an American and Indian dichotomy. It's sort of like a materialistic and spiritually full dichotomy that we see throughout the film with Indian folks, with American folks. And we see the boys grow a lot by seeing their flaws put right up in their face in a way that they've never been before. So that's all I have to say. Love you, Lise.
Well, Mike, I have to say I saw two hands shoot up the moment you started sort of saying that you kind of like got where the mother was coming from, and I don't know for certain what those two participants are going to say, but I know what I'll say, which is that I think the movie makes it pretty clear that she left, she didn't leave when they were 20, and here they are 20 years later whining. She was gone, it sounds like, pretty much their whole lives. Owen Wilson says, not to much reception, but he says, I pretty much raised us, didn't I? And, she had been gone for some time by the time their father passed, and it seems like she had been gone for years. And I think that there's a lot of room between, not embracing the conventional lifestyle of someone with tremendous resources and abandoning your children to go to the other side of the world. And I think that this movie, again, I said it earlier, is more nuanced. I think for a host of reasons, historical reasons and reasons of, narrow stereotypical ideas of gender and a whole host of reasons, you could easily imagine a movie being much harsher on the Anjelica Huston character than this movie is. And I don't think it's all that harsh. I think, at the end of the day, she's basically saying to them what everyone needs to hear at some point, which is, yes, you may have these challenges, problems, deficiencies, gaps, longings, whatever, because of what I did or didn't do. But at some point, it's up to you to handle them, and up to you to address them, and up to you to decide how you're going to do that. And I think you can say that to men in their 30s or 40s or whatever age these guys are supposed to be. It's a more mature lesson that they obviously weren't ready to hear earlier in their lives, but they also, I think, probably had a reasonable expectation that they should hear it from her. Lisa, I will let you pass on this one if you want, since obviously at some point Mike will come downstairs, but if you don't want to, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say I loved my darling husband's comments on Bill Murray's character, the baggage, and how I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, they are still at a point where they can really work on dropping their baggage. I think that's a really interesting point that had not come up in conversation with Mike previously. The idea that the mother is abdicating wealth, essentially, the trappings of a wealthy lifestyle, is also really interesting, because Anderson films deal so often with people who have achieved the American dream, like they're upper middle class, they're wealthy, and there's this like deep ennui that comes with achieving the American dream. And I think that's interestingly observed in this film. And I think there are so many instances throughout where we're reminded, kind of rubbed our faces in how materialistic these brothers are, and contrast that with a woman who can just pick up and go and has no material or emotional connections. I can understand how that could be sort of liberating in a way, and it's an interesting counterpoint to the wealthy American who has achieved all and exists in a state of ennui.
I would just briefly add, if you don't mind, that these, obviously both parents were deeply flawed people who passed along flaws to their children. I just think there's this certain, you're an adult now, kind of like either figure it out or don't element to the visit with the mother that seems very true to me. There's this, mommy's not going to come in and just put all these pieces back together for you, regardless of what she may have done in the past, that they needed to hear and understand. And they do inevitably understand it. So that's all I'd add.
Thank you for that, Mike. Let's see, Catherine, you have a question or comment.
Yeah, one of the absurd details I really enjoy is Jack's commitment to being barefoot through the and I've heard some interviews where they, as much as I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, they deny that it has any reference to the Beatles. And I just find that a little hard to believe because I can't think of a better symbolic sort of reason for it. It fits so well with this idea of the kind of Western cultural tourism of India and Western interest in Indian spirituality and everything. So I was curious if you had any thoughts on that, or if the barefootness spoke to you in a different way. Did it have other meanings besides just kind of an obvious like Abbey Road reference?
Well, I'll make my remarks brief because I can tell you what the barefoot throughout the movie meant to me. Ugh. I couldn't get past it. I just couldn't. Every time it appeared and I was reminded of it, I found it so distracting, which I know says more about me than about the movie. But I just wanted to be very clear that no one could expect any professional insights on that count from me, and it's all up to Lisa. So go ahead, Lisa.
Catherine, I too read a lot of Beatles, not symbolism, but connection in this. I mean, with the mustache and the hair, and the frame of them walking up to the airplane in a single file, which is just so clearly an allusion to the Abbey Road cover. I mean, that's what I read into it too, and I find it very hard to believe that they were not thinking of the Beatles when they wrote much and directed much of this film. I haven't read any interviews that kind of explicitly say the Beatles were a reference point here, but I'm sure of it too.
Well, and there's, I mean, a director or a writer, screenwriter stating his or her intentions directly and clearly is often a source of insight, but it's certainly not definitively a source of insight, because just as we all do in our everyday lives, make what we would call, for lack of a better term, a Freudian slip, so too do filmmakers make those on grand scales. They don't, sometimes they don't necessarily know why they're not able to articulate. I'm not able to articulate why sometimes when I choose this word versus that word. But to an outside party, it might seem to have some meaning, and the same can be true with filmmakers. So normally, I mean, I think most of the time you can give them the benefit of the doubt at their stated intent or when they deny something, but there's plenty of times you can't as well, and not necessarily because they're being intentionally deceitful. They may just not be self-aware enough to realize it. Judy, you have a question or comment? Oh, okay. Glussmans, you had another question or comment.
Well, I actually put my hand down because most of it had to do with the Beatles thought, and I would absolutely, while I agree with you that walking around in India barefoot is yuck, there was no doubt in my mind, and Janice and I looked at each other and we both said this is an homage to the Beatles and their days in India and all of that. And I don't know anything about Wes's relationship with the Beatles, but he certainly over the course of this film has given homage to a variety of other artistic talent and artistic genius. And I just thought this was one more.
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to go on the record as a last remark saying that it's not just in India. To me, it is in Bryn Mawr or Philadelphia or Valhalla, or on an airplane or on a train. I will not do it in a car. I would not do it very far. There you go.
Well done.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us and for helping us have another really interesting and productive discussion. I know that one of the reasons our wonderful instructors like Lisa join us is because they know they're going to get first-rate engagement and wonderful questions and comments on the films. And I think tonight was no exception. Would you agree with that, Lisa?
I would certainly agree with that. It always brings me such a joy to hear what the Bryn Mawr gang has to say about some of my favorite movies. So it's just as much a pleasure for me as it is for all of you.
Thanks very much, Lisa, for joining us, and we look forward to having you back before too long. In the meantime, we have some of our Tuesday night seminars, which are a more in-depth and sort of, classroom type look at our at a variety of filmmakers and film movements. In fact, one of them is being taught by Lisa coming up next month on the wonderful French filmmaker Agnes Barda. In addition, after that, we have Paul Wright teaching about Martin Scorsese, Jacob Mazer teaching about a very influential short film, La Jetée, and film critic Gary Kramer comes back with another edition of short attention span cinema focusing on short films. You can find out more about all of these at brynmawrfilm.org in the Film Studies Online section. There you can find a whole bunch of other things, including the library of all of our past discussions and links to all of the instructor introductions to those movies, as well as our library of Ask Andrew segments, which are film studies and film history mini lessons, and some really great puzzles and word finds, all film themed. There's a lot to check out there. You can also check out Theater 5, where we have new movies available to you to view at home, only available through theaters like ours. And of course, I should mention, if you want to see the movies the old-fashioned way, the way the world intended, come on back to the theater. We are open Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Wednesday. So please, we got a lot of movies to make up on, and we're showing a lot of different types of movies during these days we're open. We have wonderful precautions in place. Online ticketing only. You get to pick your seat and make sure that you get to have the film going experience you like and are comfortable with. And we're so excited to have so many of you back in the theater. We've had a wonderful couple of weekends of doing this so far, and we'd love to see you. And if this isn't exactly your cup of tea yet, we also have private theater rentals, so you can get a small group of in your bubble together and have your own theater and watch your own movie for a surprisingly reasonable price. In any case, there's a lot going on at Bryn Mawr Film Institute. We appreciate you coming out and joining us and supporting us in whatever ways you can. Financially, otherwise, by joining, by engaging, by participating. We really appreciate it. It's been a heck of a 13 months, as I know you'd all agree, but I will say for myself, it's been much better than it would have been otherwise without the whole BMFI community joining us and supporting us in a host of ways that they do. And I know you'll continue to as well. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
You.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Regards to Michael.